Hello, everybody. Hi. So it's 4 o'clock, and perhaps as chair, I could make a few words of introduction. So this is a SHARA seminar. SHARA is the Community for Higher Education Researchers in Asia. And I'm David Carless, the unit head of Hong Kong U Faculty of Education, SCAPE, and SCAPE is Social Contexts and Policies in Education. And SHARA and SCAPE are in a kind of informal relationship between the two, because some of the stars of SHARA, such as Hugo Horta and Yi Sun Jung, are in both SCAPE and SHARA. And Hugo asked me to try to organize one or two invited speakers as part of the series, and it's my pleasure to do so. And today we have Li Min from the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, a very talented early career researcher. She's just preparing the final version of her doctoral thesis for submission for examination, and that's always a big milestone. So we congratulate her on that. The paper she's going to give today is related to her doctoral thesis work, and she's bringing together three interrelated concepts: agency, feedback, and technology. And the title of her talk is Reconceptualizing Learner Agency and Feedback, a Situational, Deliberative, and Entangled Perspective. Sounds like a very neat title. She's going to talk for about 40 minutes, I think, maximum, and then we're going to open it up to discussion. So, Min, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just do a quick screen share. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Yeah? Okay. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak with all of you today. My name is Min. I'm a PhD candidate finishing up my thesis at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. HKU does hold a very special place in my heart because I did my master's here. And it was the place where I started my research journey. So I'm very excited to share more of my work with you. Today, I will share about my research in relation to learner agency and feedback. So let's begin. Perhaps I would like to start by inviting everyone to do a quick sharing in the chat on what does learner agency mean to you. Some of the literature calls it student agency. Some of them calls it learner agency. So perhaps I can give everyone a quick minute to just share a few quick thoughts on what comes to mind when you look at these two words. Yeah, so I'll just be popping into the chat. Yeah, just maybe one or two words is fine as well. Very nice. We have some entries on attitudes, being active, deciding what you want to learn, being available to learn. Proactive is another term that is commonly associated with agency. And yes, motivation is a construct that is often discussed in relation to agency. So there's many ways that learner agency is discussed in the literature, which we will cover more of it today. But this leads to two caveats that I would like to share about today's talk. First is that this talk is largely theoretical. I'll be sharing my theoretical papers with you. I'll share one more, which is a bit briefer, before I discuss the one that Prof. Carless mentioned in detail. I will also hope to help us to reflect more on what kinds of feedback we want to facilitate in higher education and research. The second is that my definition of feedback is a little broader than usual. I take inspiration from Lipnevich and Smith and Winstone et al.'s definition, looking at feedback as information and process. I also look at it that in a way that does not necessarily involve disciplinary content learning, It could be broader in general. For example, where the learner is going, where the learner is, what steps they want to take. So the process can be extended beyond feedback process or feedback loops and cycles. So let's move along. Here is an overview of what I will be sharing. I will first start off by sharing a quick introduction on what led me to research on learner feedback agency. Then I will discuss my initial exploration into the existing conceptualizations of feedback agency. Next, I will discuss how I reconceptualized it. And lastly, for points 4 and 5, I will share some interesting findings from my study. So let's go on to the first point on why I focus on learner feedback agency. So as I've shared in the past, I did my research starting at HKU, focusing on knowledge building. So this is where I was first introduced to learning analytics, where we give analytics to students as feedback to support their learning. So this includes things like word cloud. Oh, the pixelated. It didn't look so pixelated when I was doing it. But yeah, so this is a social network analysis on key terms that emerged in the community's online discourse. And these work that I've done in the past led me to a takeaway that there's huge potential in learning analytics in providing timely and personalized feedback, which is quite hard to achieve by teachers on their own. So when I was researching into learning analytics as feedback, I quickly realized that students are struggling to understand how to use learning analytics as feedback. This led me to shift to focus towards learning analytics literacy to understand the skills and competencies needed to use learning analytics as feedback. So learning analytics literacy is quite a niche area of research which involves the intersection of feedback literacy and data literacy. And my initial work, what I did was that I come up with a framework to identify some key characteristics of learning analytics literacy. I also came up with another framework to discuss about how to cultivate such literacy across the different levels of the education ecosystem. But when I was doing this study, during the pilot study, I noticed that the students, even though they had higher literacy levels, they were still not meaningfully engaged with the feedback, which made me a bit concerned. When they did engage with it, it was usually out of obligation to the teacher or just to comply with the teacher's expectations rather than an intentional part of their learning process. And it was quite evident that there was a gap between understanding what to do in feedback versus using feedback effectively for learning. So this prompted a fundamental realization that leveraging feedback requires more than equipping students with the know-how. In other words, learners must be both willing and able to engage meaningfully with feedback for learning. And this prompts the need to examine agency as a complementary need for feedback literacy to understand how students seek out and use feedback for learning. So this is the point where I pivoted to look into how to empower students to exercise their agency. Okay, now now that I have looked into the reasons why I moved to this area of research, I seek to derive a deeper understanding of learner feedback agency, which I will be calling LFA. I will first look into how they discuss it in the existing literature, which leads to the next section, where I discuss my initial attempt at uncovering the existing conceptualizations of it in the literature. Okay, so I started my theoretical exploration into learner feedback agency through a systematic review with the aim of understanding how has it been conceptualized. So following the PRISMA guidelines, I reviewed 130 papers, and here's what I found. I found that there's more and more studies recognizing that it's important to look at learner agency in feedback. But while that is the case, only a small minority of the studies directly addressed learner feedback agency. So they tend to discuss it as a desirable outcome of learner-centered feedback, one's capability to influence learning, which is what some of us mentioned in the chat earlier. Also, an adaptation process influenced by external factors, which is a more social, cultural view of agency. And the majority of the studies tend to discuss learner feedback agency obliquely through related constructs. And here are 6 constructs that overlap with the notion of agency. The first one is feedback uptake, which we commonly see it as feedback acceptance, closing the feedback loop, looking at students' active involvement and use of feedback. Feedback engagement is another construct that overlaps with agency, describing learners' active involvement encompassing behavioral, cognitive, emotional, and agentic dimensions. Student voice is a pretty interesting construct that discusses the social political dynamics of feedback agency, looking at how students express their perspectives. Student autonomy is another one, looking at students taking control of the feedback process, how they are exercising their decision-making rights, and the development of agentic disposition. Also, there's a growing field on feedback seeking. This is not new. There's just a lot more literature that's surfacing these days, highlighting students' proactive efforts in seeking feedback information. And lastly, there's a well-developed field of feedback literacy, focusing on students' knowledge and capabilities in engaging feedback information for learning. So collectively, looking at the literature that discussed agency directly and obliquely, the review found that the studies conceptualize agency in 3 ways. The first way is discussing it as enactments, actions, where the more enactments reflect higher activeness and hence reflect higher agency. The second way is through the desired outcomes, where it is a product of student-centered feedback design. And the third way is as an individual capability, like an innate trait or characteristic of the learner. In this review, I also found that the literature depicted LFA in a complex and multifaceted way, comprising of 7 facets, including individual facets like behavioral, cognitive, affective, dispositional, and also structural facets like relational, societal, and material. So for this review, it extended the existing discourse on agency beyond the individual, illustrating how these facets are interrelated with one another. Here I have metaphorically represented it as a knot to show how these facets co-construct each other in a dynamic manner. Okay, so now on to the paper that I was hoping to do a deeper dive into. For this third part, I will be sharing about how I plan to reconceptualize learner feedback agency. So earlier on in the review, I shared how the existing conceptualizations are not too sufficient at capturing its inherent complexity. So here, this is the position paper where I argued to reconceptualize it to better capture its complexity. Okay, so a very interesting insight from the previous review was that the literature had a very great emphasis on feedback, but there's lesser effort dedicated to unpacking the term agency. So with this gap, my first step was to deepen our understanding by reviewing the broader literature on agency. And I found that agency is like a Swiss Army knife of education research. It's very essential. It's used very differently in different fields, like psychology, anthropology, philosophy, sociology. They all looked at it differently. And here I summarize the 4 types of conceptualizations that are pretty prominent as a whole in the literature. So yeah, let's take a closer look at what we can learn from each of them, starting with individualistic. Okay, so individualistic perspective focuses on the self. This view is deeply rooted in the works of philosophers, emphasizing autonomy and free will. It highlights control and decision-making, but it does make one question whether it fully captures the complexity of how learners interact with feedback in a naturalistic setting. So the second type is the societal perspective, which is predominantly adopted by anthropology literature, where they examine how structural factors like social factors or cultural factors, how they influence one's agency. So this perspective emphasized how societal structures shape one's actions. And if we picture it, it's kind of like students navigating the feedback process based on the norms of the school or the classroom environment. This perspective adds a layer of complexity to show that it's not just about individual choice. It's also about navigating these structures at play. The third is the resistance approach, which is predominantly adopted in feminist studies. This perspective is about pushing the status quo. It's about exerting agency to push back against the norms. It is particularly powerful in education settings where the learners may resist certain feedback mechanisms or pedagogical approaches that don't really align with their values. It reveals agency where students don't just passively accept feedback, but actively engage and sometimes even resist to carve their own learning paths. And lastly, we have the ecological perspective, where sociologists describe structure and agency as an interplay, closely intertwined, mutually reinforcing each other like an entanglement. And this view looks at how structures shape and are shaped by agency. It's like seeing the forest and trees at the same time, right? Understanding agency is not just an individual trait, but a dynamic interplay with an ecosystem. Yeah, so it encourages us to see how feedback and agency evolve within a complex naturalistic setting. So now that we have looked at the broader literature on agency, I'm going to compare it against the existing conceptualizations of feedback agency and discuss 3 issues that I have found. So the first is, out of the 4 conceptualizations I discussed earlier, existing literature often adopted individualistic or societal conceptualizations. This reveals that existing literature often described the influence of structures on agency in a unidirectional way, focusing on how structures shape agency. However, this overlooks the fact that learners also shape the structures as well. So it's if we draw upon the prominent works by sociologists like Giddens, it will remind us that structure and agency are co-constructed. And this more holistically recognizes learners as actively involved in shaping their learning with feedback. This provides a more nuanced conceptualization that accounts for this interplay rather than viewing learners as recipients of learning experiences. So the second one is that learner feedback agency is often treated as a static construct with a tendency to classify actions as desirable or undesirable. So take this study, for example. Many studies focus on interventions that encourage specific learning behaviors, assuming that exhibiting these desired actions display learner agency, and it's always beneficial. But it tends to overlook the fact that agency is context dependent. Actions outside a desirable set of actions may actually be more appropriate. So this example is a study that focuses on increasing students' seeking of feedback. And while we can agree that feedback-seeking behaviors are largely favorable, the push towards a narrower set of desired actions without considerations for the opportunity cost or appropriateness of these actions risk eroding our learners' agency. And this can result in students prioritizing certain desired actions rather than fostering their independent decision-making in exercising agency. Yeah. So to be clear, my intention is not to discredit these studies, but to highlight a potential blind spot. Even with the best intentions, we must remain mindful of how our efforts to shape learning behaviors may constrain rather than empower learner agency. Another prominent issue is the behavior-focused representation of learner feedback agency. It is common and often valid for practitioners to make professional judgments based on learners' behaviors, but we must recognize the existence of some assumptions that we make. For example, feedback acceptance is often perceived positively and attributed to students' agreement with the comments, while feedback inaction is typically perceived negatively, as it could be attributed to students' lack of interest in the feedback. And while these behavior enactments provide evidence for engagement, it is important to know that they may not represent the whole story. I'll give you some counter examples. So maybe student A's feedback acceptance is due to passive compliance with the teacher, or maybe student B's inaction is due to a more profound realization that the feedback is not really congruent with their learning goals. And hence, in order to ensure proper acknowledgement to agentic responses, the conceptualization of agency must expand to include deliberations behind their chosen actions. So the three issues that I raised earlier are summarized in this table. In response, I propose a framework abbreviated as the SDE perspective, or Situational, Deliberative, Entangled perspective, where situational refers to students adapting to the changing needs in different situations, shifting focus from actions to more contextual nuances, deliberative, focusing on the deliberations underpinning their actions, and also entangled, where we recognize that agency is shaped by and shaping the structures around it. It is co-constructing each other. So with the proposed conceptualization, I proceeded to explore how the perspective that I proposed can help us understand feedback agency more through an empirical study. And although this study is not conducted in higher education setting, its research processes and findings nonetheless offer valuable insights that can inform the practices and understandings in higher education context. Particularly, I'm looking at how feedback processes are taking place in a collaborative, inquiry-based learning environment. So I'm going to share a bit more. This study adopted a qualitative multiple case study design, looking at learner feedback agency through the situational, deliberative, and entangled perspective. The research was conducted in a government school in Singapore, and I was focusing on a class of secondary 2 students, and there was one teacher participant, and I focused on 6 student participants. This is a 7-week historical inquiry project that is collaborative based. And what they're tasked to do is pretty fun. They're tasked to investigate 2 historical events. And they're going to share their interpretations of the historical events through a video artifact. So that's the activity. And I'm tracing the feedback processes behind this activity. Okay. The data collection involves lesson observations, student and teacher interviews, and artifacts. And yeah, okay. As I proceed on with this empirical study, I noticed that adopting such a complex perspective is pretty challenging when it comes to data analysis. It's very broad, it's very hard to encompass everything. So the existing methods tend to fall short in capturing this inherent complexity. This is because the current approaches tend to be grounded in the earlier conceptualizations, which tend to frame it as what I've mentioned earlier, more static, behavior-focused, and unidirectional. So for today, I'll briefly outline some analytical foundations of my approach. I anchored it through 3 key pillars. And let's go through the first one. So the first is to address the situational nature of LFA. The analysis needed to reflect how learners' involvement unfolds dynamically over time. And to do this, I situated their activity across 2 dimensions, which is sociality, the social interactions, and temporality, which is over time. So this enables the tracking of feedback enactments over time and social context. The second one is to capture the deliberative dimension. I realized that it is pretty challenging. We have very diverse data sources. Actions come from video data, right? Or observations data. But deliberations data come from the interviews, and they are very different in nature. And it's pretty hard to analyze them collectively. So since it is vastly different in terms of sources and formats, to overcome this, I synchronize both of the data types over time to enable a integrated analysis. The third one is in order to reflect the entangled nature of structure, I decided to move beyond textual analysis. What I found was within the existing literature, it's very hard to look at how structure and agency is interplaying because of the textual nature of the analysis. And it's pretty hard to depict these relationships. And to do it, I had to come up with a more systemic and visual method, which I came up with this visual representation termed as the anticipation graph. So this is a paper that I will be sharing in the upcoming AERA conference. And anticipation comes from the word enacted actions and anticipated actions. So the enacted actions refers to the actions taken, behavior actions, and anticipated actions is how I captured the deliberations underpinning their enactments. And by situating these enacted actions and anticipated actions within the social and temporal dimensions of structure. So if you look at the axis, right, it's temporal and social in nature. So that's how I was encompassing it, looking at situating it. Oops. Okay. Yeah. So okay, let me see if I can do something about it. Is there a way I can mute it? Oh dear. Okay, anyway. Yeah, so yeah, sorry, where was I? Oh dear. What should I do? Should I? Can y'all hear the
Yeah, just a second.
right. Oh dear. I can't seem to mute the speaker.
David, Monique seems not to be there. Can you mute it? You can mute all. I can't do it. I'm not the co-host.
What have I got to
Yeah,
do?
I think there's the triple dot.
You can mute all.
Oh yeah.
Mute all.
Yeah. Just let me give me a second. I'll see if Monique is.
I think if you
Where do I find mute all?
is there like a triple dot icon on his or her image? I think there's a mute function if you click on that icon. Oh dear.
Where's the voice coming from?
Hua Huang.
Oh, Hua Huang.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Sorry
Can you
about
spell
it.
him? Where's Monique when we need her?
Oh dear. It's okay.
Maybe you just have to try and speak louder than him.
Okay, I will do so. Okay. So right. Yeah, this visualization is my attempt. Oh dear. It's my attempt at overcoming the limitations in textual and quantitative approaches.
David, she's not there. If you go to this Hua Huang and you click on the three dots, you should have an option to mute him.
Ah,
Oh,
thanks, Hugo.
okay. Awesome. Thank
Sorry,
you.
I was looking at the wrong three dots. But...
No worries, but thank you so much. Yeah, so I will want to unpack more of this proposed approach, but given the time constraints, I'm not able to. So I'm just showing a glimpse of it here. The gray boxes on Quora, let me see if I can get this laser pointer. Yeah, so the gray box over here represents the actions taken by Cora, which is to seek feedback on project's progress. And the arrow directed to Val and the group mates refers to what she hopes other people will do. So, for example, Cora was asking Val and the group mates on some feedback on the project's progress. But if you notice that the boxes in white refers to them not responding back to her. So it was not reciprocated by the group mates. So this shows how the involvement between Cora and the rest of the team, such as Val and the rest of the group mates, look like. It will reveal at a more minute turn-by-turn analysis of how the interplay of structure and agency turn out. Yeah, so I would love to share more. Maybe if you're interested, I could do more in the Q&A. But yeah, I will head on to share more on the findings since I'm trying to keep to time. Okay, so I'm just going to share some interesting findings that I found. First, the approach that I proposed helped to allow me to see and legitimize some enactments that are often overlooked or discouraged in existing literature. So for example, in this graph, as I've mentioned earlier, the white boxes are indicating that there's no action, which is typically perceived as passivity. But during the interviews, when I interviewed this student called Ben, he mentioned that he was actually focusing on the conversation. There's always some students who are less vocal, more quiet and to themselves, and he was attentively monitoring the process and only stepped in when necessary. This case of non-action is reframed as agentic involvement. Yeah, and if we look at, so I've mentioned a case here just now, non-action as passivity, and I found that it's actually the student being quite vigilant, closely monitoring the process. Another interesting case was some effort withholding behaviors that are commonly described as free-riding behaviors. So there's a case where a student was withholding his effort in the feedback process, trying to redirect the responsibility of advancing feedback to other people. And sometimes in the literature, they describe it as free riding, which is kind of avoiding and trying not to put in the effort. But when I interviewed him, I realized that the student was intentionally delegating the task of providing feedback to his teacher. He knows that his peers are more likely to accept his teacher's feedback and act on it more than a feedback given from himself. This is actually a concept by Bandura, one of the scholars who did really great work in agency. He called it proxy agency, where students are mobilizing others with greater influence to influence their goals. And even though such behaviors are commonly labeled negatively in collaborative learning literature, like free riding, we can see that his approach was strategic, and although indirect, it played a pretty critical role in facilitating his group's feedback uptake. And this example highlighted the importance of understanding the learner's situated intent behind their actions during a feedback process. And if you think about it, everybody would perceive their structures differently, and assessing their deliberations will allow us to understand how they are navigating these structures at play. Yeah, this will help us move beyond the analysis at the behavioral level and challenge deficit-oriented interpretations to expand our understanding of what agentic feedback involvement can look like. Okay, another interesting finding relates to students' self-initiated feedback interactions with ChatGPT. So self-initiated refers to me not prompting them to do it. They decided to interact with ChatGPT on their own for feedback. So this paper was published late last year. I'm happy to share the link if you're interested. And what I found was during the project, there were students using ChatGPT for feedback on their own, and they do it pretty differently from case to case. So I will show two cases that are drastically different to give you a sense of how it looks like. So student 2, for instance, used ChatGPT for feedback on her work. She explained this, usually when I'm doing research at home, there's not a lot of people back at home and everybody is working outside. There's nobody else to go to. That's why she turned to ChatGPT. And even though she's skeptical, she's pretty cautious, right? She said, I can't really trust it, but who else is available at the hour? So she decided to use ChatGPT as a backup feedback source. And she used it largely in a transactional manner. She asked direct questions to get information for comparison with her existing work. It's kind of like the internal feedback mechanism, where I look at an information and I compare against what I know to kind of figure out what else I can do with my work. So while thoughtful, her approach remains pretty standard. So she keeps using this same approach over and over again. And her interactions with ChatGPT is pretty limited. In contrast, student 3 refused to use ChatGPT for feedback. So I prompted many times. He's like, I still won't use it. I still won't use it. And I asked why. He said, in the past, I had pretty bad experiences. And he remains very resistant to using it for feedback. And while this shows very strong self-direction, his avoidance was shaped by early impressions rather than an ongoing evaluation of whether this tool is useful for me. And this could potentially limit his future opportunities with GenAI. But what I found interesting was that across all the cases that I analyzed, the students' initiated interactions with ChatGPT for feedback were rather constrained and routinized. And a deeper analysis revealed 2 reasons for that. The first is that the students' responses or interactions with ChatGPT are guided by a very limited repertoire of prior experiences with GenAI. So if you think about how they were introduced to it, it's not because a teacher introduced to it, it's a self-adoption. So they have been using GenAI the certain way that they have been. And because it kind of works, they keep sticking to the same patterns. If they are thinking, oh, I want to use GenAI for feedback, and they think, how do I know how to use it? They'll keep going back to the way that they have been doing, which is to get a direct prompt, get the information I need transactionally, and I will leave with the information I need. So they will keep yielding similar feedback experiences, though not necessarily bad, but there's more potential that could be explored, maybe more inquiry-based way or more dialogic interactions that could surface from it that didn't manage to appear. The second reason is that the students don't tend to experiment or ideate alternative ways to engage with feedback. So when I ask them, are there any other ways that you can use ChatGPT for feedback? They will say, no, I don't know. This is the only way I know. It shows that actually, when left to their own devices, the students are not intuitively inclined to explore new ways to enhance their feedback experience, which tells us that perhaps more deliberate interventions to promote a more dynamic and open stance towards feedback with tech could be done with GenAI. Okay, so to sum up, adopting a situational, deliberative, and entangled perspective allows us to better understand the nuanced and context-sensitive ways in which learners navigate and exercise their agency in feedback. This perspective enables us to surface diverse narratives, which can be affirming or challenging about how they are engaging with feedback across different contexts. And these insights can meaningfully inform us on how we understand and design feedback processes to be more responsive to the learner's realities. And at its core, the information or knowing what to do with the information is also about how the learners are choosing to be involved and the meanings they construct in the process. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop share and we can discuss together.
Yes, thanks very much, Minda. Very informative and well-designed presentation. Perhaps as the chair, I'll take advantage and ask the first question.
Sure.
So you seem to be focusing on the deliberative in the response to feedback input. So the learner gets an input, and it could be from a teacher or from a peer, it could be from generative AI. Then they might kind of ignore it, or they might engage with it, or they might use it, or they might reformulate it. So my question is, I think both methodological and practical. In terms of methodology, how can we capture what students are doing with the feedback input, wherever it comes from? And I suppose in practice, I'm also thinking as a teacher or even as a doctoral supervisor, we may give some kind of advice to a learner, and it may have short-term applications or it maybe have long-term applications. And I suppose I'm wondering how we gauge. It's already quite difficult, isn't it, to gauge what they've done with it, but then in the behavioral sense, but then if we've also got to engage with what was the deliberation, and then if I understood it in your example, because they were school kids and there was presumably a relatively short term, you could interview them and find out what they did with the inputs. But I suppose I'm thinking that for other inputs, this might be quite difficult for us to gauge. So what are the different ways in which we could try to understand the deliberations that a learner went through in order to do something or not do something with the feedback input?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's a very, you hit the nail on the head on the hard part of this research. It's the deliberations that's very hard to get to. And I think there's many ways maybe we can, I feel that capturing what the students are doing with the feedback is not as hard as capturing what they are thinking when they are doing with the feedback. And to do the latter, there's two ways that I came up with. The first is a reflection sheet would be very prompt. For example, after a certain feedback event, they write down why they do things a certain way and all, which I can share more on the prompts later. But the way that I adopted was a stimulator recall interviews. I chose this method, and it's a one-to-one setting because I noticed that young kids tend to mimic what each other say. So I chose to do it one by one, which is not very practical for practitioners, but for research purpose, I thought that it will give me richer data. And from this interview process, I realized that when we prompt, if we try to figure out what they are thinking, and we simply ask them, why do you do things a certain way? You will get pretty, you don't get very deep insights into what they're actually thinking. They'll probably say, oh yeah, because I tend to do it like that. That's how I usually do things. And I learned how to come up with prompts to help to probe deeper into understanding what they're thinking. For example, one prompt that I thought was pretty good was, were there other alternative approaches that you came up with that you thought you could use, but you didn't, and why? And if I share the thought process behind that prompt, it's if they say that, no, I don't come up with other ways, that's the only way I've thought of, it shows that they are lacking ideation in alternative approaches. But if they said that, yeah, there's other ways that I choose not to do, it also reflects the rigidity of the structures that they are interacting with. Maybe I decided not to ask my friend because my friends won't care. They perceive their friends as being very rigid and hard to influence. Yeah, so these are some strategies I adopted to look into what they are thinking. Yeah, I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So perhaps we could continue with oral questions, and then later we could come on to some of the questions in the chat. But anybody else who'd like to pose a question?
Maybe I can ask one question. So thank you so much for really interesting talk. I do sociology, so in the sociology, structure means quite different things like social structure, economic structure, etc. So when you explain this agency and structure, I wanted to clarify what structure really means in this learning context. Like, does it mean like classroom or schools or teachers, curriculum? And that's how do you define the structure? And how does the structure work in a kind of ChatGPT learning context?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Happy to hear that you're from sociology, so I'm happy to hear your thoughts. So yeah, the way I define structure is quite different from sociology because I realized that if we want to look into learning, I cannot really adopt the sociology way to look at it if I want to look at each individual student. It needs to be catered to that learner. And it forced me to relook at how should I look at structure meaningfully to understand learning context. And what I did was I know that structures can be very varied to something very immediate around you. For example, classroom norms, to something very far away like curriculum or the institutional or national type of typical approaches that they do things. So what I decided to do is to focus on the immediate structures within the class. And why I decided to do that is, if you notice, my analysis method was involving the multi-agent and temporal. It's because within the multi-agent, if I'm trying to trace the interplay, it's going to be very challenging if I don't do that. So within multi-agent, I can see who is directly influencing how I am exercising my agency in feedback. So for example, maybe you post a question on, hey, I'm trying to seek feedback on this historical event. Your action immediately post a set of, it's kind of your action will cause me to act in a different way already. This immediateness, right? So maybe another teacher came by and said, hey, tell me more about your work. It's instantly influencing how I'm going to exercise my agency from a moment-to-moment perspective. So my redefinition of structure is more immediate. It's to allow me to analyze within a learning activity, episode by episode. I also have this implicit assumption that broader structures will be manifested through the agents within these immediate structures. So for example, the broader structures is that students in Hong Kong are very polite, and it will implicitly be manifested through the turn-by-turn interactions. But that's an assumption and also a limitation in my study that I need to recognize. Yeah. I hope I addressed it. I really like your question too. So I hope I did it justice. Okay. Yeah.
Min, maybe you could have a look at the chat. There are some quite rich questions there. For
Okay.
example, Alison Chan has got a question with 3 likes to it. It's asking about activities, feedback activities that teachers can use to promote more deliberative agency, and then something also about redesigns. Can you see what Alison's asked?
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, there's 3 applauses
Yeah.
next to it.
You want to try that one next?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Alison, for the question. Just reading. Okay. What are some activities to promote deliberative agency? How would you suggest institution redesign traditional courses to okay. Well, your second question is a tough one, but I can do the first pretty easily. Okay, the first question. I think we tend to, or rather when I first started it, I was thinking, oh dear, that design intervention is going to be very complicated, but it's not. It's just about asking the students to share what they're thinking. But the way that we ask needs to be asked in a more intentional manner. For example, like, okay, why do you choose to not use this feedback? This kind of questions will prompt the students not just about the value that I find in this feedback, but rather my stance when I'm interacting with feedback. Is there a deeper reason underpinning the way that I'm approaching things? And with that layer, we can dive a bit deeper to understand, okay, why do you feel that way? Perhaps it's some structural influences that's constraining you or enabling you. It's to me, the way that I'm suggesting now, it's by prompting, by reflections, sharing thoughts, which perhaps doing it in a classroom-wide setting as a class discourse would be pretty interesting to see what everybody is thinking, because everybody will have different perspectives on it. It can also be done in the reflection sheets manner. That's some quick ideas that I have. I hope that helps. I think for teachers can also reflect on what their involvement are. I think that will be even more interesting to think about as well. So teachers can reflect with them, okay, so how am I playing up, or how am I contributing to the structures at play? And am I causing you to not want to do certain things, or am I kind of forcing you to do corrections on the feedback, right? So this kind of open discussions allow for the idea of students being able to shape the feedback process at the same time. It's not just us contributing to what the feedback process will turn out to be, but we are allowing the students to shape it as well. Yeah. How will you suggest institutions redesign course evaluations? Oh, Entangled interview. That will be a thesis on its own, your second question. And I don't know if I can address it, to be honest. I feel like I might want to learn more before I make some policy decisions on it. I feel like right now, what's more important is to come up with cases and narratives on how things do play out. Maybe common narratives of certain feedback, or rather common narratives of how students exercise their agency, and what are some narratives that are problematic that we need to put in place some policies to prevent or change things up, re-engineer their feedback process. That's what I will do before getting to that second question. Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, maybe should I go down the list or in the chat? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
Neil Gautam seems to be asking you to speculate on AI feedback and whether a learner could insert into the prompt engineering the previous feedback they've received and maybe contextualize so that they could get even more precise inputs from generative AI. And I suppose there are broader issues around generative AI that you might like to comment on.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think prior to using generative AI for feedback, we should probably let the students know the conditions, or rather the limitations it has. I think there's a huge field on AI literacy that's working on it. In fact, the team in Hong Kong is pretty strong in advancing AI literacy. I think when students interact with Gen AI, they tend to see it as an authoritative resource. They tend to treat it as like a teacher telling them what the correct answer is, or that's from the study that I saw, I did. And that is concerning to me. Even if the students said that I'm a bit cautious, but when they see the information presented in such a fluent and nicely written up manner, it will give the impression that it's right for younger learners. But I think for higher education learners, they'll probably be more aware of the limitations of Gen AI. And do you think it can become better at providing feedback? There's a lot of studies recently on self-regulation with generative AI tools that is doing this work that you are asking about. Personally, I feel like the problem is how much automation do we leave it up to generative AI? I feel that generative AI, as part of the structures, they are kind of another agent that is at play, right? But this agent is not like a human agent. They are more obedient. They are more able to take information from various sources. And how should we treat them? That's a question that we should think deeper into when we want to utilize it. Personally, I see potential, but I feel that we need to have a lot of caveats before we can let the students be able to really use it well. For prompt engineering, there's a lot of work on it as well. But I feel like maybe we should work on how the person is interacting with the tool instead of how the tool is structured to cater to us. Yeah, so that's my stance on it. Yeah, I hope it helps.
And as learners become more sophisticated in using generative AI, and as generative AI continues to develop, what then do you think would be the special contributions that humans can make that generative AI couldn't make in terms of feedback?
Okay. I found this is something I didn't share in this presentation, but I did find something pretty interesting in my thesis. In my main thesis, I talk about stances, the stances people take when they approach feedback. What stances, for example, my stance is a receptive stance. I will accept everything that comes. Or my stance is a more delegative stance. I'm trying to delegate the work away to other people. So I realized that humans can take on a lot of different stances when they're interacting in not just feedback, but learning in general. If we think about Gen AI, the stance they take tend to be pretty stagnant at being receptive. And it really brought me to think about what makes us human, you know. Yeah, that's something that prompted my thoughts on it. I don't have good answers to that, but that's a starting point that made me want to look deeper into in the future. What stances and what kind of stance should we take when we approach the use of Gen AI for learning? Yeah, what's most fruitful? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe there's a lot of questions, so I should really try and see. How can teachers reduce risk where agency exacerbates inequities? Oh, okay. So voices, right? Thank you, Kaiwen. Kaiwen's question was about there's some inequities that could be in place in a class where there are more dominant students that are kind of overpowering the conversations. Yeah. So how can teachers reduce the risk of that? I feel like what I'm trying to do for my research was also partly trying to give a voice to the students who are more quiet and overlooked. That's why I looked into their deliberations. So in terms of what can teachers do, I think teachers have a tough job. They have to respond intuitively to what's happening in class. But I feel like in terms of reducing inequities, trying to give the students a chance to share what they are thinking is my approach to help to overcome this. That I think it shows in my study, trying to get them to share what they're thinking, even though in typical situations is a bit more challenging. Yeah. Within my study, I did interview some students who are quieter in nature. So those are part of my scope, my students that I focused on. And they really do think quite a lot differently. And looking at what they're thinking and getting them to share what they're thinking with the rest is pretty interesting to start. Yeah. So yeah, I think more conversations on how everybody is involved needs to be made. Yeah. I shall move on to the next one from Carol. In light of your discussion on LFA, how do you view the emerging trend of educators implementing AI tools for a course to provide instant feedback? Do you think this approach is good, in short? Yeah, so within my study, the teacher said this comment in class: feel free to use ChatGPT whenever you like. I recommend and hope that you all do so in your historical inquiry project. And with that said, sometimes I wonder if it's good. And indeed, one of the students that I didn't share, he did a more the use of Gen AI was not too good. He did a copy and paste style of using of Gen AI, which is very concerning from a teacher standpoint. I do think that implementing AI tools or Gen AI tools needs to be done with a bit more care, a bit more yeah, a bit more care. For example, before I give the students to let them use it, have a discussion on what are some limitations that they have before doing so might help. When I did eventually share with the teacher on some of the things that the students did with Gen AI, he got really concerned. He started thinking, okay, maybe next time I should say certain things beforehand. All these stuff, I feel like I didn't cover it in my work, but there's a lot of good work that's being done on it right now. It's in the field of AI literacy. So yeah, I will be more cautious lah before using it for feedback. But I don't think it's bad. Okay, maybe another way to approach it is let them know it's not an authoritative resource. Yeah, it's definitely not. And let them know that treat it like an opinion that you can consult instead of an absolute right or wrong. Yeah. Okay. What might be the practical implications for unveiling the various deliberations? Oh, okay. So thank you, Sharon. Sharon was asking about what are some implications for unveiling these deliberations behind feedback enactments? From a more both theoretically and practically, unveiling these deliberations, what I was hoping to do is to contest some discouraged enactments that are in place, that are overlooked. For example, my quiet student is not active. My quiet student is not paying attention, and it's not necessarily true. That's one example. Or the delegative case where the student is trying to get other people to do the work, which I realize is not necessarily bad. He just knows that his friends won't do it unless it's someone of a higher influence coming in to do that for him. So yeah, I think what we can do from this outcome is to be more aware that taking a behavioral level analysis or assessment has its limitations. There's only so much we can see and understand at the behavioral level. And maybe we should do a due diligence to uncover what they are thinking underpinning their behaviors before we make a decision on whether something is good or bad. Yeah. So hope that addresses it. Wow, there's some very tough questions on curriculum and policy, which I think I mentioned earlier that I think my study is more exploratory in nature, seeing the potential of this perspective. And yeah, I feel like more work should be done before I get to the policy level. Plus, I'm only looking at a class, so I can only give like class level policies, but not like institution level. Yeah. So sorry about it. I'll do more work and share more in the future. Okay, can your research on feedback agency be transferred and applied to agency research in L2 area? For example, in scenarios where teachers set up new courses or participate in PD. Yeah, definitely. Maybe, I'm not sure. I get your question right, Nick. Will you want to elaborate in person? Are you still here? I think you are. Nick, will you want to elaborate on your question so that I can get it right? Or are you too shy?
They're often too shy, but
Oh, okay. Should I
it
try
sounds
harder?
like they want to know more about possible other applications, but I suspect it's beyond what you've done, isn't it?
Yeah.
So maybe.
I think yeah, I think the situational, deliberative, and entangled perspective is still applicable to various scenarios. If you think about it, all I'm advocating for is when we look at feedback, let's not just focus on certain actions that we know if students take is pretty good. For example, I want my students to take up the feedback I give, but always consider that there's a situational approach where there are certain circumstances that may lead to a different set of behavioral outcomes that is not what you anticipated. And let's keep an open mind to it to uncover what they are thinking, which is the deliberative element to it. So figure out what they're thinking and before I make a judgment call. And Entangled is to try to account that the students can also shape the whole process. It's not just us as educators shaping this process for them. They are also capable of choosing what they want to do and how they want to be involved. Yeah, so I do think it's applicable in different scenarios, but I didn't look too deep into L2 yet. Yeah, so okay. Wow, what does a situational feedback process look like in higher education setting? What would be your suggestions that you find effective to stimulate deliberative engagement? Okay, for your second question, I think I addressed earlier on some prompts that you can give to the students on how to prompt them to share their thoughts and get them to reflect. But for the first question on what does a situational feedback process look like, we are all doing it right now. Everything is situational. Every action we take is based on the circumstances at play. So there's not necessarily a single process that we want them to go through, but we should just be aware that the chosen form of enactments are dependent on our interpretations of the circumstances. Yeah, so yeah, that's how I would approach this. Okay, I think I have hit one last question from Athena. My question is on how can teachers strike a balance between their feedback and feedback from Jenny I to help students learn better in the higher ed context? Okay, I feel like this question has a bit more on a practical slant to it. Like if I'm a teacher and I'm considering feedback provided by me versus feedback provided by Jenny I will leverage tech if I really feel like I cannot give timely and personalized feedback as much as I want to. Then perhaps, yeah, looking for various sources is pretty good to get an idea of how you're progressing. Personally, teacher feedback is important, but it's also coming with a lens that the teacher has. The teacher will have an idea of what's important to them in their course, and the feedback will come from that lens, focusing on what the teacher values. For ChatGPT or Jenny I, they do not come with that lens unless you prompt for it. So it's pretty different, but feels like it's a practical situation, teacher versus tech-based. When do I want to leverage tech? I will think if I want, I won't think it's either or. Maybe it's just different sources of information, and which maybe gathering more sources of information can let me compare more with what I know. It might be good. Yeah, it's just different sources. Yeah, I hope that helps. Okay, I'm trying to give you responses that will help you. So please do let me know if you want to expand on it. Okay, thanks. I like your
Yes, I think
take.
I think you've done an excellent job in weaving through a variety of questions. So thanks everybody who put questions into the chat, and thanks very much for your very professional answers. I think probably we can draw the seminar to a close. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything, but as chair, I'd like to thank you very much for a very engaging presentation, very nicely delivered. Thank everybody else for joining in, and unless anybody else wants to say anything, I think I will just thank everybody and draw matters to a close.
Thank you everyone for the time. It's always a pleasure to come back to HKU virtually. I enjoyed sharing my work with everyone. So thank you, Prof. Carless, as well for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, and have a good evening.
Bye.
Thanks, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.